Show right now at 560theanswer.com.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. And lawyer representing Andy No, he is the journalist we've talked about the last couple of days who is beaten on the streets of Portland, where he lives, for the crime of covering the Antifa thugs who have essentially taken over Portland, or are at least allowed to roam around the streets, direct traffic, and beat people up without consequence.
You said that the police let them direct traffic?
Yeah, this is several months ago, but yeah, there was video of them directing traffic, like they've taken control of the streets.
And the way they dress, they look like SWAT team members. Seriously, I couldn't tell the difference between a police officer and an Antifa.
The telling comment in Andy No's statement about what happened to him, particularly I'm thinking of his interview with Tucker Carlson. You know, he's a passive guy, never been in a fight, said, I was not presenting like I was ready to fight. I wasn't ready to fight, but they saw that as a sign of weakness and they pounced, which is so indicative of the thug, right? I see somebody weak who I can overpower, so that's what I'm going to do. And if he essentially retreats, then that's provocative to me. That's how despicable these people are. And I'll tell you how this is going to end, by the way. We mentioned sort of in passing. You know, on the streets of Chicago or somewhere else, they're going to run into the wrong guy. It's going to be the scene from Gran Torino.
Oh, right.
Did you ever run into a guy that you shouldn't have messed with? Yeah, that's me. And somebody comes at somebody with nunchucks, and somebody responds with a bullet.
Yeah.
That's how this is going to go, because in
if you
places
bring a
like
crowbar to a protest, something's going to happen. Too.
And in places like Portland, when you have law enforcement abdicate, that's how it's going to go. This is serious business, and Andy No should be applauded for being a pacifist, number one, being a good journalist, number two, and not backing down intellectually in the face of thuggery. His attorney, a gentleman named Harmeet Dillon, tweeted out, "Good night, everyone except Antifa criminals who I plan to sue into oblivion and then sow salt into their yoga studios and avocado toast stands until nothing grows there, not even the glimmer of a violent criminal conspiracy aided by the effete impotence of a cowed city government." Okay, well, that's a statement. By the way, I would not limit my litigation to Antifa.
I'd sue the police department for sitting on their hands.
The city of Portland is the deep pockets.
Right.
And you want to set a precedent, you bring the city into the action. So I hope Mr. Dillon does precisely that, which leads us to a conversation more generally about big tech, online media, where a lot of what you saw on the streets of Portland metastasizes and then translates into action on the streets. For that discussion, the need for new rules, and I'm not going to go into my impersonation of Dua Lipa.
Oh, okay.
I won't do that.
Are you sure? Come on.
No.
What if I beg you, please?
New rules for social media. We're pleased to be joined by Daniel Friedman, who was a contributor to Quillette.com, where Andy No is also a contributor. He's also the Edgar Award-nominated author of Don't Ever Get Old, Don't Ever Look Back, and Riot Most Uncouth. Daniel Friedman, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi.
So the premise of your piece is to go through some of what has become of big tech and the issues that have arisen with the conduct of those who are in control of the big social media platforms, and to suggest some new rules that need to be instituted with respect to social media, more consistent with the freedom-oriented values of Western civilizations like America. So give us a bit of perspective and with some specificity on what you think those new rules should be.
Well, they're under a lot of pressure, or they feel like they are, because they are social media. So social media pressure feels like real pressure. So I don't think that there's really a huge constituency that's looking to change the rules of social media, but there's a very enthusiastic and they seem influential on the platform's constituency that's pushing for that. So a few weeks ago, there was a guy who has a web show with Vox. His name is Carlos Maza.
Oh, yeah.
And the comedian Steven Crowder, who's a conservative comedian, has been just making fun of him. And, I mean, the things he's called him are not nice things. They're, like rude stuff. He's sort of a shock jock. And Maza was calling for YouTube to intervene. And YouTube conducted an investigation and found that even though these were not nice things he was saying, that didn't contravene their policies, which harassment, as YouTube had conceived it, was really more toward criminal harassment rather than this schoolyard stuff. And that makes sense. These are both adults. And when somebody's calling you names and you are a grown adult, you don't necessarily need to go running to have a teacher to look for a remedy to that. You can either ignore somebody calling you names or, you can engage it on your own terms. But, I mean, you don't need an authority figure regulating that conduct necessarily. And that was sort of YouTube's view. People who are annoying you, people who are insulting you, that's one thing. It's another thing when people are harassing you or trying to direct violence your way. But that's not really what they found Crowder was doing. And when YouTube did not ban him after this outcry, there was a lot of backlash against them, and so they have implemented a new hate speech policy.
And what are the existing rules then?
Well, so they've been making new rules at all the platforms, and they don't really work together because they couldn't under antitrust laws. So it's sort of been happening piecemeal where maybe one platform will institute a policy, and then there will be pressure on the others to implement similar policies. Last year, Twitter, Apple, and YouTube, and I think Facebook banned Alex Jones. And then Twitter said that they wouldn't. And then there was a backlash against Twitter, and Twitter said, well, he hasn't violated any of our policies. And then, according to Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, he went on a podcast tour. And I think, I want to say this was on Joe Rogan that he said this. What happened was people started combing up and down Alex Jones's whole Twitter history to find something that would violate Twitter's rules. And then they did. And then they banned him a couple of days later.
Yeah, I get that. Right. So they target particular people who have been leveled up for targeting, and then they work to fit their rules to the conclusion that they want to draw, like banning somebody or shadow banning somebody in the case of Twitter. But what are you suggesting should be sort of the way forward, and how do we get there?
I think free speech is always a good principle. I don't support regulation of these platforms by any government. They get to make their own rules. But because they are where so much of our political discourse takes place, I hope that they feel a social responsibility to support a robust discourse and to protect unpopular opinions on their forums. Free speech has a very strong philosophical tradition behind it. There are reasons why you want to protect speech, and especially political speech. And the speech that needs to be protected is unpopular speech. And this is not a conservative or liberal principle. Every ideological persuasion has found, times in history when its speech was unpopular and it needed these protections. And it wasn't very long ago at all that it was liberal or progressive speech that was potentially subject to regulation and needed the protection of free speech rights.
So your argument is normative. It's not legal. You're saying this is what these social media platforms should do. They should be the public square and allow for speech consistent with First Amendment protections. but you're not calling on the government to sort of demand they behave like, well, the government.
No, I'm pretty skeptical of regulation and government control of private enterprise.
Interestingly, too, this is a fun paragraph from your piece at Quillette. How Free Speech Dies Online is, again, the title of the piece. And it kind of reminds me of Martin Short, his Jiminy Glick character, when he interviewed Mel Brooks. And he says, so what's your, what did he say? What's your hang up with the Nazis or something like that was how he opened. It was hilarious. But you write, I'm Jewish, so I'm not a big fan of Nazis, but I'm also pretty skeptical of progressive activists because when they can't find a Nazi to punch, they often settle for punching Jews. Where are you going with that setup?
All right. So I strongly believe that the best protection against anti-Semitism is always individual rights. I don't think that it's good for historically victimized groups to look for special protections. When people talk about marginalized groups, what it means to be marginalized is power is used against you. So what you want is curbs on power rather than power exerted ostensibly for your benefit, because that's always a double-edged sword that gets turned around on you. So when I look at stuff like Antifa beating people up in the streets, I mean, they're ostensibly anti-racist, but gangs of people marauding through the streets beating people up have historically never been good for the Jews. So,
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in your piece too about
Well,
Oh, sorry. Finish.
Finish your
Excuse me,
thought,
sorry.
please.
well, so it's such an easy jump for them to say we're against white supremacy, and there have been numerous incidents where people have made a very similar argument to this. Someone says, what's white supremacy? Or white supremacy? Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
And then they've gone from punch a Nazi to punch a Jew in like 2 steps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in your piece, you showcase, when the Nazis marched in Skokie in 1978.
And it was a huge controversy, and the ACLU at the time was very cognizant of what were, in that period, right-wing attempts to censor more progressive speech, to censor art and expression that was considered obscene at the time. This is a culture war that happened a few decades ago, and people seem to have forgotten, where, particularly those campaigning for civil rights, campaigning for gay rights, were threatened with censorship and needed the protection of free speech. And so at that time, the ACLU was very absolutist in protecting that for everyone, because if there's any, break in that armor, then it's going to completely fall apart. It's a very slippery slope once you permit any regulation of speech. So the ACLU came out and successfully defended the Nazis. They said, they wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois, which at the time had the highest concentration of concentration camp survivors, of any place outside of Israel. Mm-hmm. So this was a very offensive place for neo-Nazis to march, which is why they picked it. And, a lot of people obviously didn't want them to march, but the ACLU and the lawyer was a Jewish guy, stood up for free speech. They said, there's not a danger here that justifies impinging on these fundamental principles. And then when the Nazis finally had their march, it lasted 10 minutes, and there were less than 20 of them.
It's, the argument that you make is the argument that Brandeis made in his holding in Whitney v. California in 1927, where he said, if there be time to expose through discussion the falsehood and fallacies to avert the evil by the process of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. And you say, well, so there you go. Just refer to Brandeis. But I think the point that you're making through your work product is that argument needs to be made generation after generation after generation. And frankly, there are just fewer people making that argument today, and almost nobody on the left making that argument.
Unfortunately, historical memory seems to be pretty short. And it seems like activists just don't remember that a generation ago, within living memory, people on their side really needed these protections. And then the other thing is, when you drive this stuff back into the shadows, there's nobody really confronting it. Holocaust denial is illegal in Germany and in several other countries. But, once people stand up and, you have the information out there and you don't act like it's such a dangerous idea, then it's full of holes, and,
it dies under its own
falsehood
weight.
of it is
Yeah,
pretty evident.
right, exactly.
But if it's treated as forbidden knowledge and it's shared in secret, then, it's a lot easier for people to be persuaded and indoctrinated when all these exchanges are happening sort of below everyone's radar. I let these people come out in the open, share their bad ideas, and be embarrassed.
Daniel Friedman is the Edgar Award-nominated author of Don't Ever Get Old, Don't Ever Look Back, and Riot Most Uncouth. His piece at Quillette.com, How Free Speech Dies Online. Daniel, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.